To this day, Glenn Gould is both loved and loathed for his iconoclastic recordings of famous piano masterpieces.
You'll be shocked.
Now, did you hear that catastrophe?
But among those who knew him personally, he was both loved and loathed for something else. Calling in the middle of the night just to talk.
Many are the friends who would get these unsolicited calls at 1, 2, 3, maybe even 4 in the morning.
Like a brilliant 10-year-old who just wanted to talk all night and say, oh, and you've got to see that. Oh my gosh, that's so wonderful.
It sounds innocent enough. What could go wrong?
My friend gently suggested to Glenn it would be a good thing for his marriage if we could reschedule the call to a slightly earlier hour. And Glenn was horribly, horribly embarrassed and excused himself and hung up, but he never called back again.
Happy wife, happy life. But still, it's tough to lose out on the chance to be phone friends with one of the undisputed artistic geniuses of the 20th century, known for
his tremendous verbal acuity. He could speak at great length on many, many different subjects.
So, what was it like to stay up talking after midnight with Glenn Gould? Well, now you can find out for yourself.
I personally would love that.
The Glenn Gould Foundation has recently released a rare private phone call between Glenn Gould and journalist Tim Page that took place in 1980, just 2 years before Gould's passing. And it's a revelation.
This was never, ever expected to be heard by anybody except the two of us.
In this video, we're going to do a little eavesdropping on the phone call, listening to a few highlights that I think are particularly revealing of Gould's deep convictions on the most pressing topics of music and artistic freedom. Not just of his time, not just for Gould fans, but for any human being.
I suppose that is ideally the world as I would have it now or at any time.
Joining me to discuss the call will be none other than Tim Page himself.
Isn't it lovely to hear him just having fun on a late Saturday night and trying out all these ideas?
As well as the CEO of the Glenn Gould Foundation, Brian Levine.
The Glenn Gould Foundation, we were established within a year of Glenn's death, and our founders were Glenn's closest professional friends and colleagues.
The foundation is known for awarding the Glenn Gould Prize, a kind of Nobel Prize for the arts, as well as engaging in Gouldian conversations about art and ideas.
So we dreamed up the idea of a podcast called The Gould Standard. We have kind of in-depth conversations with artists from all across the creative world.
And it's on the Gould Standard podcast that you can listen in on the full 90-minute conversation between Tim and Glenn. Available on podcasting platforms, or click there to watch the video version on the Gould Standard YouTube channel. This is your chance to vicariously chat with one of the great minds in history. And unlike most of Gould's public interviews, it's entirely unscripted.
I don't think it's something that I can discuss in print.
You see, Gould wasn't one to improvise in his public appearances, but rather, he kept himself composed. Literally.
The conversation that I am writing will appear to be completely spontaneous. It will be anything but. It will be on the teleprompter and very carefully rehearsed.
And this antipathy to extemporaneous public speaking, I think, is related to Gould's rather low opinion of musical improvisation, which he saw as relying too heavily on cliché.
The thing about improvisation is that it has to come quickly, and it must rely heavily on devices that have already secured a place in the mainstream of musical activity.
For that reason, Gould valued a high degree of premeditation in creative work, and therefore tried to elevate his TV and radio appearances to the level of composition, writing out conversations in full so that he and the interviewer assume predetermined roles in a script. One such example is actually with Tim Page from 1982, in Gould's last recorded interview where he analyzes his second recording of Bach's Goldberg Variations.
Hello, I'm Tim Page, and the music in the background is the opening segment from one of the most celebrated keyboard discs of all time.
When we started recording this, all of Glenn's funniness went away. We were very definitely doing a project, and he wanted us to concentrate on it and get it done.
Are you the type who positively relishes basking in the glow of sessions past?
No, I don't think I do much basking, Tim, but it doesn't really dampen my spirits, at least not usually, to be confronted with the sins of my youth.
The D-minor sonata, which I played just for kicks once, and I just thought I should see once in my life what it felt like to play a Chopin major work. And it didn't feel very good, and I decided never again.
It just amazes me because it's a very different human being you hear here.
And The tape features a few of Gould's cheeky hot takes on beloved romantic composers.
You ever think you'll make a Chopin record?
For the same reason that I wouldn't make a Rachmaninoff record. I don't think he's a very good composer.
But it also features lengthier passages where Gould shares his warm-hearted affection for one particular romantic composer, Richard Strauss.
If there were 16 concertos and 32 sonatas by Richard Strauss, I would play all of them. I'd record all of them.
But even more interesting is the good faith interrogation Gould must undergo on why he holds such unpopular opinions on music.
I have always felt that the whole center core, if you like, of the piano recital repertoire, Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, is a colossal waste of time because they labored under the delusion that the piano is a homophonic instrument, and I don't think it is. I think it's a contrapuntal instrument.
And in a kind of good cop, bad cop moment, Tim Page hands questioning over to composer Paul Alexander.
I'm curious, since you yourself are a composer, what do you think are the important issues confronting composers these days?
This leads to a rare moment where Gould is at a loss for words.
Well, my goodness, I don't know.
Is then forced to collect himself and introspect.
I really don't know how to answer that question because I'm not sure that at any... all right, I guess there's one big issue.
And ultimately articulate and defend his aesthetic ideals.
I would like to see a world in which absolutely nobody cared what the other person was doing.
Remember, Gould is talking about the world of music composition here. Of course he cared about people, sometimes even romantically, as is detailed in another recent Gould Standard interview with Cornelia Foss, Gould's erstwhile lover.
Gould is and always has been a sex symbol.
But we digress. In the private call, Gould elaborates on this fantasy world where no musician cared what the other person was doing.
To basically free yourself from the accumulated baggage of other people's ideas, the herd instinct. And he believes that there is a great power in each of us that becomes liberated when we simply stop caring.
There is a kind of super concentration of idiot curiosity, and that particular super concentration breeds incestuously, it seems, its own terrible zeitgeist problem.
I was growing up in an era where if you were a composer, you were basically taught that the two leading composers of the 20th century who had changed music utterly and who you had to follow along with were Stravinsky and Schoenberg.
A kind of two-party system, if you will, propped up by an ideological media apparatus. Sound familiar?
I can't say to you I would like to see the reaffirmation of the tonal system in its original glory, and or I would wish to see a return to pure surrealism. Haven't got an axe to grind. I would like to see a situation in which the particular pressures and polarizations that those systems engender just didn't exist.
These sentiments actually run counter to the common depiction of Gould as flagrantly dogmatic in his views on music.
I detest audiences. I think they're a force of evil.
Mozart, especially in his later years, was not a very good composer.
It's deliberately provocative statements like these that rub a lot of people the wrong way and seem a lot like Gould has an axe to grind.
Haven't got an axe to grind.
What Gould means is not that he doesn't have strong opinions, pardon the double negative, but that he refuses to accept that there's some pre-existing aesthetic tendency or ideology that individuals must adhere to in their creative process.
There is a much bigger message in Gould's work and his own struggle for personal freedom, which is the bonds of social expectation of what other people think are a straitjacket. If we really want to be truly self-actualized human beings, we get actualized by ourselves, not by what other people think is right and proper.
Gould thinks that art and ideas should be judged on their own terms, in the relationship between their content and form. And furthermore, that he admires most those artists and thinkers who refuse to succumb to external pressures.
One of the reasons I really liked Glenn was the fact that he loved Richard Strauss. And his whole idea was I don't care what other people are doing.
What appeals to me most in Strauss is that all things said and done, he's a very defiant old man, not in terms of overthrowing tradition, but in fact of holding with tradition. This is why I love him so very much. Indeed.
Defiantly conservative.
Indeed.
Here's a guy who adores Richard Strauss, who also admires Schoenberg profoundly.
One doesn't really expect somebody who's so warmly taken on the cause of Schoenberg as you to have an equal affection for Strauss.
Yes, I've been told this often, Humphrey, and I've never understood why these two affections should be so contradictory. They are, I suppose, if one holds a very doctrinaire view of the course of 20th century music.
If you look at the pieces in Strauss that most attracted Glenn, I think Gould was looking both with his architectural mindset, but also with his aesthetic view for things that had true universality, that basically did not belong to a single time or place, but basically could find a place in the heart of any human being at any time, anywhere.
Compare, for instance, this example from his Metamorphosen.
He once said, for example, that a day had not passed in which he didn't stop and contemplate the Metamorphosen. It was probably his single favorite work, maybe other than, late Bach.
In the private call, Gould brings up a script he's having trouble writing for a program all about fugues he would record with French director Bruno Mont-Saint-Jean.
It is an absolutely impossible mission to try to deliver any important thoughts on the nature of fugue.
And I find it very apt, if you notice, Gould actually talks about writing a television script the way a composer would write a fugue.
Writing this bloody thing all week, going off in 16 different directions, trying to see which 3 or 4 of them could be harnessed together in some appropriate way.
And on this topic, I actually found a very insightful YouTube comment. Yes, those exist, especially on this channel, I'm proud to say. But this one was underneath the Gould standard video of this private call. Luna King 3807 writes that, "When I heard Glenn talking about struggling with the script for the program with Bruno, it occurred to me that perhaps the motivation behind all the scripting was not so much a need for control per se, as a desire to effectively communicate important ideas within a limited time frame." Gould is indeed often mocked as an egoistic control freak for scripting his interviews, yet his intentions are precisely the opposite. It's actually out of a concern for the viewer who might be subject to off-the-cuff cliches on the subject of fugue that Gould labored for weeks on end trying to compose something meaningful about it. And this again relates to Gould distancing himself from what he called
the hedonistic pursuit of improvisation as a way of life.
And in this, yet another fully scripted television program, polemically titled How Mozart Became a Bad Composer, Gould raises the stakes on what he saw as the dangers of improvisation.
And that's why I think we can learn from Mozart why his reliance in his late works on a facility for improvisation provides a real object lesson for the 20th century. Because the 20th century is the age of the debatable motive, an age occupied with the problem of whether and to what degree our thoughts derive from a conscious industry or result from concealed desires.
In other words, improvisation, or extemporaneous speech for that matter, might seem on the surface like the epitome of freedom, but is more often than not just a mouthpiece for interchangeable stock phrases that aren't your own and say nothing original. For example, just about every word you've heard me say in this video was written down ahead of time. Yes, even that one. And this one. All of them, pretty much. And that's because if I have any hope of communicating something meaningful about a complex topic like Glenn Gould's personality and aesthetics, I couldn't just turn the camera on and start talking. I have to spend countless hours figuring out how all these subjects and counter-subjects fit together in a coherent piece. A kind of video fugue, if you will. Speaking of which, in Gould's final composition for his fugue program, he articulates what he finds so beautiful in late Bach in much the same terms as he does for late Strauss.
The interesting thing about that final fugue, and to some extent about all of the Arte Fugue, is that in it he literally turns his back on every tendency abroad in the musical world of his time.
Well, by the time he wrote it, fugues were very unpopular.
Oh, well, hugely unpopular, and fugal adventures of this size and tenacity were simply unheard of.
I find that extraordinarily moving. That doesn't mean it's good or bad, it's just that he finally at that point said, I don't care anymore, you know. There are no more Italian concertos in me.
Third movement, take one.
Gould once called the Italian concerto Bach for people who don't like Bach. And that's because it exemplifies Bach traveling in the Vivaldian fashions of his time, the antithesis of his late fugues. While Gould is usually seen as a devout Bachian, the truth is he liked some Bach a lot and other Bach not so much. In the same way, he liked late Strauss, but not so much Der Rosenkavalier. And believe it or not, the same is true of his opinion on Mozart, which he reveals to Tim Page in the private tape.
Mozart sonatas, the early ones I love, the middle ones I love.
The point is, Gould believed you should never assume a piece by one of the A-list composers is necessarily good just because it was written by one of the A-list composers.
The actual data that goes into a particular reaction, perhaps most particularly including the identity of the artist, is terribly, terribly unimportant.
Gould called this the Van Meegeren Syndrome, after the controversial Dutch painter and art forger Han van Meegeren, who produced paintings in the style of Vermeer that were so good, he convinced experts of their authenticity and sold them at auction for tens of millions of dollars. Gould writes, the determination of the value of a work of art according to the information available about it is a most delinquent form of aesthetic appraisal. Indeed, it strives to avoid appraisal on any ground other than that which has been prepared by previous appraisals.
If you cut yourself off from that kind of data and live in a world in which there is total anonymity, in which everybody is a Van Meegeren forging his Vermeer, sort of thing, I think that would be heaven.
Thus, Gould was opposed both to what we might call conservative identity politics in classical music, where you favor music just because it was composed by certain dead white European guys, and progressive identity politics, where you promote music just because it was composed by more diverse artists. Both succumb to a logical fallacy, where the data of who authored the work of art somehow has bearing on the merit of that work of art. Gould cited Han van Meegeren as a personal hero of his because, in the most dramatic fashion possible, he put the lie to identity-based appraisals of art. As Gould scholar Geoffrey Pesant put it, all that matters aesthetically is how the instrument is played in relation to the music itself, here and now. By whatever means the performer can best get into a close relationship with the music, into a state of ecstatic communion with it, by that means the performer can best realize the aesthetic value of the piece. And quoting Gould, the performer has to have faith that he is doing, even blindly, the right thing, that he may be finding interpretive possibilities not wholly realized even by the composer. As I mentioned in a previous video about Gould, this notion is totally scandalous to those who believe in a pantheon of infallible genius composers and tailor their approach to musical performance accordingly. But in Gould's ideal world of total anonymity, none of that matters. Instead, when interpreting a musical work, Gould saw a kind of three-tiered hierarchy of concern. At the top is the idea or conception of the work. Number two, the sound world that idea inhabits. And a distant third is the physical or tactile execution of the piece at the keyboard. In what Gould called technique factories, the conservatories, these values are turned upside down. The first priority is an obsession with technical execution. Then, among the more sensitive musicians, sound is considered. And three, the idea, is rarely a factor and is usually replaced with a kind of genius worship and identity thinking I just described above. But Gould practiced what he preached and strove always to make his idea of a work audible at the keyboard. One of the great ironies of Gould's recorded legacy is that he was so absorbed in a musical work in just this way, immersed purely in the idea he found at the heart of it and the world of relational possibilities it provided, that he unconsciously sang throughout the performance. And this ended up leaving his own signature of sorts, which is the opposite of anonymous.
Right now, I'll caution you that this should be a straight piano solo without vocal obligato.
I don't know how they could possibly have slept against Glenn's playing and also his singing. And I think he forgot where he was. He was in a trance.
His quirks, things like the way he swayed and moved and hummed when he played the piano, absolutely authentic, genuine, never put on, not for a second.
We were going on until 1 o'clock in the morning, until 2 o'clock in the morning, till 3 o'clock in the morning. And I'd sometimes say, Glenn, I've got to go. And he'd look at me and say, oh, you can't go now, you can't go now. And he would go right back into his trance again.
It's just the way he immersed himself in the music. The second thing is that he was a person capable of extremely deep concentration. When he talks about the ecstatic experience, losing oneself completely in the music, it's 100% what he experienced. And his ability to transmit that is, to my way of thinking, the primary key to his enduring fame and celebrity, that he is able to communicate such an intense and inward musical experience, which is what he was experiencing himself.
Gould's nocturnal and hermit-like tendencies enabled him to shut out the world and go in search of artistic discoveries.
I think that what mattered the most to him in the entire world was his work, and that the reclusive image, it really was a device that allowed him the privacy to basically work almost continuously. And at any one time, he would have had 5, 6, 7 major projects on the go, devoting a great deal of time and energy to all of them.
And in one of those projects, Gould actually went in search of fellow hermits in remote regions of northern Canada.
Could we talk a little bit about your concept of north? You're known to take lengthy trips off by yourself into the North Woods.
My name is Glenn Gould, and this program is called The Idea of North. I've been intrigued for quite a long time now, really, by that incredible tapestry of tundra and taiga country, as they call it, which constitutes the Arctic and subarctic of Canada.
The Idea of North would be the first in Gould's Solitude trilogy, a series of documentaries in which Gould wove together testimonies in the form of a fugue, of course, what he called contrapuntal radio.
And as we flew along the east coast of Hudson's Bay, this flat.
I don't go, let me say this again, I don't go for this northmanship bit at all.
Because it just seemed endless.
I don't,
we seemed to be going into nowhere.
Knock those people who do claim
and further north we went,
farther north and so on. But I see it as a kind of a game.
This program, however, brings together some people who have had a rather direct experience of the North, who've lived and worked there one time or another, and in whose lives the North has played a very vital role.
Gould was ultimately less interested in the geographical remoteness these people experienced than the psychological and spiritual distance they achieved from the buzz of modern life. That super concentration of media curiosity that Gould found so threatening to individual autonomy.
Most were city slickers initially. The characters who had stuck it out long enough and removed themselves from the sense of curiosity about how the world reacted to them had developed, obviously, in an extraordinary way.
These people Gould encountered were his fellow travelers, not necessarily in terms of their beliefs, but in the form by which they pursued truth.
That means that a lot of what gets said is completely contrary to my own particular views of things.
Just like the subjects and counter-subjects of a fugue don't always agree, they cooperate in a sort of musical democracy, a kind of impossible libertarian socialist one, unfolding independently but together in harmony.
I think it was this sense that they were going to undertake something which enabled them to say, I really don't care whether my colleagues back at the University of fill in the blank, or the Department of External Affairs, or whatever. I really don't care what they think of this imposed solitude. I am going to do it because I'm going to discover something, you know.
A purification process.
Yes, exactly. And I think it could have happened if they had simply locked themselves in their closet, you know.
So when you titled that docudrama The Idea of North, you meant exactly that. Rather than North, you meant, again, the idea. Which,
Exactly.
That's quite fascinating.
And this speaks to yet another seeming contradiction. Gould is, on the one hand, dedicated to hermitage and against commercial media interests, but on the other was fascinated by technology and achieved immense fame via profit-seeking media giants. As the late cultural critic Edward Said wrote, Glenn Gould was a recording artist on contract to large corporations for the whole of his performing life. this did not prevent him from being an iconoclastic reinterpreter of and commentator on classical music with tremendous influence on the way performance is executed and judged. This challenges the classic dichotomy between art and commerce. Doing things for their own sake and doing things in order to make money are obviously in conflict, but the greatest artists in history managed to transcend this divide. Just take Beethoven, whose late sonatas are thought to epitomize the values of capital A art, composed for their own sake and floating high above the mundane exchange of goods and services. And yet, as musicologist Barry Cooper details, Beethoven agreed to compose his last 3 piano sonatas for 40 ducats a pop, which his Berlin publisher managed to haggle down to 30. Musicians dedicated to spiritual discovery like Beethoven or Gould didn't entertain the naive notion of a pure, absolute autonomy from the constraints of everyday life. That's really only achieved in death, which, last time I checked, is somewhat counterproductive to creativity. Money and media were just part of the landscape of challenges faced by those seeking to find truth and share it with the world. And it makes you wonder how Gould might have responded to the supersaturation of media and technology we're experiencing today, with the extreme promise and threat of artificial intelligence looming on the horizon.
The information explosion, I think, would have pleased him in some ways, but of course, Glenn hid from that too. I think he liked to have it there the same way I think he would have loved the internet, but he would have controlled the internet and very, very carefully.
If Gould were alive today, he would be staying as far away from social media as possible, no doubt. But I like to think he would have started his own YouTube channel, and who knows what kind of content he would have come up with.
You're watching the Glenn Gould YouTube channel, and as always, if you feel so compelled, do smash that like and subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the bell.
Yeah. For now, you'll just have to subscribe to the Gould Standard podcast and listen to the full hour-and-a-half private phone call. And there you can also hear more from Tim Page reflecting on his friend Glenn. And since you've made it this far, go ahead and smash those like and subscribe buttons. And if you really like this content, consider subscribing to my Patreon. There I compile the notes and research I do for this and all my videos. And I've also posted my own private call with Tim Page, as well as Brian Levine, that I recorded in preparation for this video.